Well, welcome to Volunteer Leaders in Action. I am Anna Guest, the founder of Rising Tide Volunteer Solutions, and I am really looking forward to this conversation today with Erica Marks. Erica is the Director of Volunteer Services for AgeWell, the largest agency on aging in the state of Vermont. And she has been training and supporting volunteers for 17 years. At AgeWell, she led the growth and development of the volunteer program, taking it from 100 volunteers to over 1,000, one of the largest programs in the state of Vermont. She and her team created the innovative Volunteer Respite Squad program, which won the 2021 U.S. Aging Recognition Award in the caregiving category. So, Erica, I'm so amazed and inspired by the work that you lead. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Great. So I'd love to dig right in. And I'm just like thinking 1,000 volunteers is an incredible core. And so let's start by having you share just a little bit about the work that you do and how volunteers are a part of it.
Okay, that's like the easiest thing you're going to ask me. Um, so our volunteers mainly do two things. I kind of think of there's the big umbrella, and then there's sort of two avenues for volunteers. One is that we are the largest Meals on Wheels program in the state of Vermont, and all 100% of our meals are delivered by volunteers. So volunteers who are not just delivering a meal, but are also doing a safety check, checking in, making sure the client is okay, and letting us know if something is needed. And then on the other side of our house, if you will, are all of our volunteers that fall under our friendly visiting umbrella. And those are all the volunteers that um, are assigned to individual clients in order to help them be able to stay at home. So, some really good examples are if someone is getting Meals on Wheels, but they have no way to get to the grocery store and no way to get groceries, they're still going to need a grocery shopping volunteer. They can either take them grocery shopping a couple times a month or go grocery shopping for them, right? We take people to medical appointments. We just do friendly visiting. We match our volunteers based on common interests. So if someone is socially isolated and doesn't have anything to look forward to, then a volunteer becomes an ongoing friend. We provide respite to caregivers. So that's another thing that volunteers do. Volunteers will do minor home repairs. They'll change batteries and smoke alarms. They'll change batteries and hearing aids. They will help with finances, whether that's help balancing a checkbook or writing out the checks for the client to sign or taking them to the bank or to run errands, all that kind of stuff.
Really incredible. And in listening to your description, it sounds like it just enhances 100-fold what your organization is able to offer and support people within the community, which is just incredible.
Yeah, to give you some perspective, we deliver 238,000 meals a year, which boils down to, I'm going to say, between 13 and 1,400 shifts. And on the friendly visiting side, we do over 1,200 shifts a month. So that's over 1,200 visits from volunteers every month.
Oh, really, really amazing. I always get goosebumps thinking about what is possible with volunteers that just wouldn't be otherwise.
Yeah.
So again, I'm just thinking about the sort of infrastructure and thoughtfulness that goes into supporting 1,000 volunteers well. And so I want to ask you if you feel like you have a superpower as a volunteer leader and what that might be.
So I asked my staff this because I want to know what they would say. And they all agree. My superpower is making sure that every volunteer feels connected to us and supported by us. So no volunteer feels like they're in this alone. Um, that is what makes our volunteer program successful.
That's really beautiful. The goosebumps continue because I feel like that is just so much aligned with what I know to be true, and what always felt really important to me when I was working directly with volunteers.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. I love that. So we're here today to have a conversation about difficult conversations with volunteers, and we can feel free to reframe that terminology as we go along if that feels like it's needed. Um, but I've heard you speak on this topic and share some really thoughtful perspectives and strategies, and so I'm really excited to dig in. I think this is a common area that can present some challenge for staff and just a lot of feelings of discomfort and avoidance. And so I wanted to start by asking you, why is having difficult conversations important? And do you have some guiding principles for how you approach them?
Yeah. So hmm, this goes back to something I said earlier. If if my goal is that every volunteer finds their niche so that they're volunteering in a way that they enjoy the most or that they find most rewarding, then being able to have difficult conversations is critical to accomplishing that. Because if a volunteer is going astray and I'm reluctant to have a conversation with them about it, and I allow them to continue to go astray, it's likely that their experience is going to end up being problematic because I don't arbitrarily set rules and boundaries around what volunteers can do and can't do. It's all based on years of experience of knowing this is what leads to success and this is what doesn't. So, a good example of that would be that I tell every volunteer when we're onboarding them, please don't give your phone number to the client. We are the gatekeepers, and here's how, in the days of cell phone, here's how you prevent them from getting your phone number. Dial *67 before you call them. That will block your number so they can't see your number. Now, why am I asking you to do that? I'm asking you to do that because it's really important that we have clear boundaries around what volunteers can do and what volunteers can't do. And although 95% of our clients are absolutely respectful and grateful and would never, step a toe over whatever those guidelines are, there is that other 5% who are unable to understand what the guidelines are or why they are, or they're unable to follow those guidelines. And I don't want you getting calls from volunteers at all hours of the day and night. I don't, that it's not appropriate. Now, I know that a lot of my volunteers break that rules. We might as well talk about that if that's okay, Anna. Once they get to know their client and they say, oh my God, I don't have to worry about this. Sally would never call me unless we were getting together for something. And they choose at that point to not block their number or give their number. And it often happens innocently. Like, Anna, you might say to me, oh, Erica, I have a doctor's appointment next Wednesday at 11, and they're going to confirm that the day before. Um, so when they call to confirm, if it's different, I can call you and let you know. And I've been visiting with you for 3 months now. I have no worries about you breaking that rule. I might give you my phone number at that point and say, great, Anna, just give me a call when you hear from them. So it's not like they're doing it to, like, they're being rebellious. I don't mean it in that way, but there are lots of reasons why a volunteer might share their number, but they're cautioned by me not to do that until they're sure that the client will respect the boundaries.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. And it just makes me think about one of our roles as volunteer leaders, I think, is to be thinking those 3, 4 steps ahead to the unfortunate situation that nobody wants to have happen, but puts a volunteer in a really uncomfortable
Yeah.
position. And now a boundary has been crossed and it's hard to backtrack.
I, I also train my volunteers. I say, we want to always, if there needs to be a bad guy, let it be us, not you, because we don't want you to do something which would negatively impact your relationship with the client that you're serving. So if you show up and they say, oh, Erica, next week I have to go to the bank and then I have to drop some money off at my sister's house. Could you take me? Regardless of whether you're willing or not, you can always say, oh, I need to check with my supervisor. I'll get back to you. Then you get to call me and I get to say, well, Anna, do you want to do that? And
Hmm.
if you say, yeah, I really do, I feel fine about it, I do want to do it, it works in my schedule, I say, great, go ahead and call and let her know that you checked with me and it's fine. But if you don't want to do it, I can be the one that calls and lets them know, Anna let me know that you needed her. She's not available. Would you like me to find someone else? Or I can help the client understand why it's not a request that can be filled by a volunteer. It
Mm,
allows me that opportunity to provide education and support to the client as well.
yeah. Man, there's just so much thoughtfulness baked into this around um, the boundary piece, but also, um, just really, like, really walking the walk in terms of being there for your volunteers and not forcing them to operate in a vacuum where they are having to make decisions sort of on the spur of the moment and, you know, not knowing if they're doing it because they really want to or they feel obligated or they feel potentially even manipulated. And yeah, that's
Right.
really, really nice. And another thing I like that you said early on was sort of setting some of this structure or boundaries based on um, your sort of long term or even like clinical reasoning almost around what's
Yeah.
successful and what isn't. And that stuck out to me because I remember this turning point, even much earlier in my volunteer management um, career, where it was like there was a time when I really didn't feel like I had that solid foundation of understanding to
Sure.
set down rules and or to sort of issue specific guidelines. And then I remember when I started to feel more confident in doing that. And that's a really great sort of explanation of why, is because I felt like now I had a good working understanding of why it makes sense to do things this way and not
The
another way.
truth is, I'm a rebel at heart. So if you tell me don't do this unless I understand why, unless it makes sense to me. If it feels arbitrary, I'm gonna be like, never
Yes,
mind that, right? And I just assume that every volunteer wants to have an understanding of why we do things the way we do them. And so that just seems like a respectful conversation to have.
that makes so much sense. And I feel like it's probably a good practice to assume that your volunteers are sort of going to be rebels at heart, not from a place of like wanting to be chaotic, but from this place of like, well, why should I, I'm here to do this part of the role I really love, but why should I care about these other things that you've set in place? And so
And
yes,
they're
if
passionate and they're dedicated and they're enthusiastic. And it's easy to say, oh, yeah, I can do that. Oh, yeah, I can do that. Um,
yes.
and I want to make sure, if you're going to say yes to something that I didn't ask you to do, in addition to making sure it's an okay thing for you to do, right? I also want to make sure I'm capturing your time and I'm capturing your mileage. So that's the other piece of it. There's a
Mhm.
programmatic piece as well, Anna, which
Yes.
is in order for me to go out and get grant funding for my program, in order for me to have money designated in the area agency aging budget, right? I have to be able to show the impact that those volunteers are having. And I can't do that if I'm not capturing their time and their stories and their miles.
Mm, yeah, really great. Oh, I'm just reflecting on how much power there is in sort of bringing some of these um, issues out of the dark and sort of out of the taboo of talking about them. I just think that there's so much power for everybody involved when we take the time to talk about about all the things that we've just been talking about with our volunteers and um, make that part of the time that we invest as leaders, but also acknowledge that it's important, time and conversation for volunteers to be involved with as well.
Yeah.
So this feels like a really good point in the conversation to maybe ask if you could share an example of a situation that felt like it felt like it needed to be addressed with a volunteer, and if you can walk me through sort of how you prepared and what you
Yeah.
said.
I like to do two if I could, Anna. I'd like to do like a sort of more simple, more common example, and then maybe a more complicated example. Would that be okay? All right, so we'll do the simple one first. People apply to our programs because they want to volunteer. And sometimes in the application that they fill out, everything looks great. And in the background check, everything comes back okay. And then you start having the conversation and you realize, ooh, I'm not sure my program is the right fit for this person, either because the availability they have doesn't match up. Like maybe when they filled out the volunteer paperwork, they were available on Wednesday, all day Wednesday and Friday mornings. Now there's been a change at their job, or there's been a change in their childcare schedule. Something's changed, and now they're really only available on Saturdays. But we don't put volunteers into clients' home on Saturdays because we're not open on Saturdays and we wouldn't be there to support the volunteers. So you find out something about their availability and you go, or you start listening to what they're looking for, or they start sharing something about other work or volunteering they've done, and little red flags start to go off like, uh-oh, maybe we're not the best fit. So being able to say that, I learned my lesson a long time ago. I came from, I had no training specific to managing volunteers, lots of supervisory training, right? And and I have a master's degree in psychology. So I have that, but managing volunteers is different than managing paid staff. It should be different. I mean, out of respect for the volunteers, it should be different. And I learned the hard way. Like it's trying to say yes to everybody and finding a way for everybody to fit when there's just something that's even in your gut that says, this doesn't feel right to me. Being able to guide that volunteer, being able to say, hey, Anna, my gosh, we would love to have a volunteer like you, but it really sounds like your availability is really limited. And I don't want to take you on as a volunteer and not be able to find a client for you. I mean, I'd rather you go and volunteer somewhere else where they can really use you and you can really enjoy the rewards that come with volunteering rather than me taking you knowing that there's very little chance I might only be able to find something for you to do twice a year. So, really learning how to be able to help guide someone to say, we'd love to have a volunteer like you. I don't think our program is the right fit for you. Have you thought about and making some other suggestions about different organizations that they might volunteer with? So that's the easy one. And it's the one that comes up commonly. I think it takes, you got to do a half a dozen of those, not addressing it before you maybe get up your courage and say, wait a minute, I don't want to waste my time or their time, right? But a more complicated situation would be when you have a volunteer who is overstepping their boundaries. And you've done the education up front about whether it's confidentiality or whether it is um, that a volunteer um, cannot ever sign any legal documents for a client. You can't be in their will. You can't be their designated, medical anything. You cannot have a legal or fiduciary relationship with a client. That's a really important one. And what happened to us is we had a long-term volunteer who was assigned to a client, and over a 3-year period, that client's abilities diminished. That client needed to go into assisted living, and that client was going to need somebody else to assume fiduciary responsibility for her. And my case manager said, hey, did you know that your volunteer called me and wanted to know about this? And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. What do you mean she called and asked about that? And so they gave me information, and I immediately picked up the phone and I called the volunteer and I said to her, I understand how much you love your client and that you've become really good friends and that she needs you more now than ever, that her abilities to manage things are diminishing. But I need to remind you that this falls outside of your role as a volunteer. And she's like, but I'm the best person to do it for her. And I've done it for other people. And I'm an accountant. And I'm like, I understand that you have the professional credentials and that you have personal experience doing this for other family members. You cannot do this for her. So she didn't like that. And I said, um, it's not negotiable. This is, you cannot serve in this capacity with this client. Okay, all right. And then I found out, so she agreed, okay, I won't do that anymore. And she stopped trying to be the fiduciary agent, but then she wanted to interview the potential fiduciary agents, and she wanted to have decision making capacity in who the client chose. At which point, I then said to her, it seems to me like I'm asking you to do something which is really impossible for you to do. I'm going to have to remove you from your role as her volunteer. I cannot have you continuing to be associated with AgeWell and to be an AgeWell volunteer and act and be asking these kind of questions. Or so I had to let her. Not only did I have to remove her from being a volunteer with that client, but I actually removed her from being an AgeWell volunteer altogether because I felt like there was no way for it to be a positive experience. So that's like a more complicated example.
Yeah, that's really, those are two excellent examples. And one of the things I just really admire about your approach is um, the clarity of the communication, and just really keeping it focused on this is sort of an expectation or a duty of the role.
Right,
Where is there not a rub with you, but
right.
where do things not align in your life or your situation with that role? Um, and
Anytime, like you're going to have difficult conversations with volunteers, and you might even need to let someone go. But my goal is that they never leave feeling badly about the interaction. Like if I can be respectful of them in the interaction, they can at least feel good about the interaction, even if they don't feel good about the decision.
Yes, right. It's that thing about people don't remember, I don't know what you said, but they remember how you made them feel.
Right, right.
And Erica, I know I've heard you speak before also about, maybe a situation where you hear through the grapevine, maybe it's from a staff or another volunteer about so and so did something this way. I'm
Oh,
not
yeah.
really sure that was right. And you have a really nice way of opening that conversation. Can you talk about that?
I can. I think it's real. So I guess this is sort of my philosophical approach is that everybody has their own experience, and no two people's experience is the same. And so if I'm going to call Anna to find out what happened, to say, hey, Anna, I heard that you had an interesting visit the other day. I'd love to hear more about it. So I'm inviting the volunteer to share with me what their experience was. Um, and I can always find something in what they say that allows me to take that next step into wherever I want that conversation to go. That's very different than me calling and saying, hey, I heard that while you were at their house, this happened. Like, that's so, to me, that feels like I'm being scolded or like I've done something wrong. I don't ever want to volunteer to feel that way on the other end of a conversation that I'm having with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so thoughtful. And I think how we start those conversations and the feeling tone we set at the beginning of them really is what allows a conversation to play out in a positive way or in a defensive and sort of closed off way.
Yeah. I wouldn't even necessarily need to say, Anna, I heard you had an interesting visit. Yeah, I could just pick up the phone and say, hey, Anna, it's me checking in. I haven't talked to you in a while. I'm wondering how things are going. Tell me about your last visit.
Yes.
Now the volunteer's not put on the spot at all. They don't think I'm calling because I heard something. And they have,
You've just gone on mute.
sorry about that.
Don't worry.
They have an opportunity to tell me from their perspective how things are going. We don't need to put people on the spot. I try to avoid putting people on the spot. I don't like being put on the spot. And it doesn't like engage me in free sharing. What I want is the volunteers to free share with me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just I feel so inspired every time I hear you talk about this because I have oftentimes in the past felt like, oh, how do I open this conversation in a way that um yeah, it doesn't make me feel like I'm micromanaging someone or that I'm nosing into like this performance review, and
Right.
especially with volunteer. I mean, really with anyone that feels very uncomfortable, but particularly with volunteers,
Yeah.
I think it feels really gritty. um,
When it's the philosophical basis for your program, you end up doing it like we have a routine, we have a process where anybody who hasn't logged their hours who had a visit this week on Friday afternoons, they get a phone call from one of my staff saying, hey, I noticed that you didn't log any hours, your hours with your this week. Did you still go on your visit? How did it go? Right? We check in because we want to make sure everything's okay. I had a situation yesterday where one of my Meals on Wheels volunteers went to deliver to a client and the client was deceased. And so they called in to say, I just want to let you know I'm at so and so's house and they're deceased. My Meals on Wheels coordinator told me about that when I came back from a meeting. And I reached out to the volunteer and said, hey, Patrick, I'm just calling because I heard that when you went to one of your clients' houses this morning, you found them deceased. And I just wanted to check and see, are you okay? How are you feeling? How can we support you? And he's like, oh, I'm perfectly fine. And you don't know this, but I'm a firefighter. This is not I mean, it's sad. I don't mean that, Erica, that it's not, but I'm really okay and there isn't any support that I need. But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't checked in.
yep, really
So
thoughtful.
we try to be proactive and responsive rather than reactive.
Yes, I love that. So this is another place I'd love to sort of take us down a different pathway, which is, so say a volunteer leader has attempted to initiate a difficult conversation and it really doesn't go as well as you hoped it would. Um, maybe you didn't sort of start off right, or it just felt really defensive. What would you recommend as next steps or sort of course correction?
Okay. There's a couple things and it depends. So you got to give me that. So um sometimes if if you're not keeping the volunteer, that's different than if you are keeping the volunteer. So if you're not keeping the volunteer, you can always write a handwritten note that says, thank you for talking with me the other day. I felt kind of badly about the way it went, but I just want you to know we wish you the best, right? You can always do a handwritten note that uh, if you're not keeping the volunteer. If you're keeping the volunteer, there's tons of opportunities. The first is for me to reflect on, why did that not go well? What happened? It might be that I got triggered. I mean, I'm human, right? Maybe I got triggered. Maybe they pushed a button and I responded in a way. If I had just stepped back and taken a deep breath, I might have responded differently. Maybe they got triggered by something that I said. And then I have to think about, is there a different way I could have said that that would have led to a more positive. So it's really about self-reflection and about processing out loud with your team. Here's what I said, here's what they said. What do you hear? What do you see? What suggestions? Like sometimes it's not just me, but it's me doing it with someone else on the team. Um, and there's always the opportunity to call back and say, Anna, I feel terrible about my tone of voice when I was talking to you. Can we have a do-over? I'd
Mm,
love to have a do-over. I mean, you can always apologize. You can always say, I don't feel good about how that went. Can we try again? Human.
yeah, really nice. Those are great suggestions, and I love that invitation to do some self-reflection afterwards, and talk through it with team members if you have those, to sort of get some perspective. That's really
I'm going to
helpful.
call someone back and say, I really think that I upset you and that wasn't my intention and I'm really sorry. Can can we talk?
Hmm. Excellent.
I've
So
never had anybody say, F you, Erica.
yeah,
They're like, wow, thank you for calling back.
yeah, it's really nice. Um, so I've also heard you say that your volunteer department has a mission statement and a philosophy, sort of not independent from, but separate from your organization's mission. And so I'm wondering if you can share with us why that is important and how does it relate to having difficult conversations?
Yeah, I can definitely share it. I always tell people that our program has a dual mission, and our first mission is focused around the volunteer. It is our goal to help every volunteer find their niche within our program where they can volunteer in a way that feels most rewarding to them. So that is our primary mission, is to make sure that the volunteer is volunteering in a way that's rewarding for them. And then I say the icing on the cake is that when we consider ourselves professional matchmakers, and when we get the match right and I match a volunteer with a client, the client benefits from having an ongoing meaningful relationship with a volunteer.
Hmm.
And so the volunteers understand that they come first with us and that our goal is to find volunteer opportunities for them that they enjoy and that they find rewarding. So when we have to have these conversations, we're not calling about, because we want to find fault with them. We're calling because can you tell me more about what happened the other day? We want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to support you.
Mhm.
And when you approach it that way, they'll tell you everything. They have no reason not to.
Um, how do you sort of approach that? From the staff perspective too, and like if like the assumption I'm going to make is that if my staff are really well supported, and you know um that then they in turn will support our volunteers, and sometimes I think there's quite a disconnect there, that staff aren't really resourced to support volunteers to the sort of benefit of the volunteers and ultimately the
Yeah,
clients. And so I'm just kind of curious how you approach that at your organization.
yeah. I lucked out. When I first started supporting volunteers, I was working for a hospice organization, and the CEO's philosophy was if I do everything I can to take the best care I can of my staff, I'll never have to worry about patient satisfaction, because if the staff feel good about themselves and about what they're doing and the organization they're working for and our mission, that will translate into the care they provide to the patients. And he was absolutely right. And so I like stole that from him. I'm like, oh my God, I never thought about it that way. And so when I built my volunteer program, I built it same philosophy. I'm going to give my staff everything I can to support them in doing this work so that they never feel like they're in it alone. They're never afraid to come and talk with me about something that didn't go well. They're never afraid about making mistakes. They understand making mistakes is all part of being human, and that they can always count on me to give them feedback in a way that is respectful.
Mm,
Um, I can give you a concrete example if you want one.
great.
So, we had a volunteer appreciation event yesterday, and we did all this. It was a drop in coffee and pastries. And we did all this planning around, okay, who's going to get the food and what are we going to have and who's going to set up the room and who's going to do the registration and all those things. But what we didn't talk about was who's going to cover phones while the volunteers are dropping in and we're doing this. And so what ended up happening is that um, I ended up covering phones, and one other staff person ended up covering phones, and everybody else, all the other staff, got to enjoy being with the volunteers, hearing stories from the volunteers, and supporting the volunteers. And then all the stuff that was left over got left on my table in my office. And I was like, this is not right. As the director, I didn't even get to make an appearance. How does that feel to the volunteers that
Mm,
the director wasn't like, if I had come in and said, hey, you guys, I'm covering the phones today, but I want to spend a few minutes with you, right? We didn't plan, we didn't make the right coverage plan. So the two of us that were on the phones felt like, ooh, we need to plan this better next time. And then
mm,
I said to the staff person who dumped all the stuff on the table afterwards, you know, I felt like I didn't get to go to the party, and then I was expected to put everything away after the party, and that didn't feel good to me. So let's come up with a job breakdown sheet, JBS, as we do this all the time. Let's create a JBS that includes not just the prep, but actually includes coverage during all events and the cleanup and putting things away after the event.
mm.
And that's how we handled it.
Really nice, really thoughtful. Yeah, and it's always those those things that don't go the way we imagine them that end up being our, some of our strongest learning opportunities.
Yeah.
So,
And it's never with blame. It's, oh, okay, now that we did it, it didn't feel good. This didn't quite work. That didn't quite work. But I'm also a very big proponent, Anna, on if it didn't work this one time and it's something we're going to do again in the future, let's create a JBS. Let's think through from the minute we start to the minute we end everything that we didn't include this time. Let's create a system so that it's an automatic that we're looking at all of those components next time.
mm, yeah, really nice. And I think one of the things that you said that really just jumped out at me was, that didn't feel good. And I think in the workplace often there's hesitancy to name that, like it feels, I think I've felt that in the past. I think other people um, oftentimes feel uncomfortable just acknowledging that something didn't feel right or didn't, and it's not so much about how it went. It's like, well, what's that feeling? And
Well,
so I,
my staff know I'm a very big proponent. Like, if I were to ask you, Anna, and you might know the answer to this, what percentage of our communication is verbal? What would your guess be?
oh, it's like something tiny, probably like 10 or 20%.
Seven.
7%.
7% of our communication is verbal. 93% is everything else. So if it didn't feel good to you and you don't put it in words, that doesn't mean that we're not going to pick up on the fact that it didn't feel good.
Right.
Right. And then we're left having to try and interpret. It's much cleaner, it builds better relationships to be able to say, I didn't feel good about this. Can we talk about this? Can we figure out a different plan for next time?
Yeah. And there can be this feeling, I think, of sort of being gaslit too. Like when everyone kind of knows it didn't feel good, but
Yeah,
nobody's talking about it.
yeah.
So yeah. Well, so again, like just to, I mean, for me, this ties back to earlier in our conversation, just how much value there is in that sort of open communication, transparency, in lots of different places.
Yeah. I
So,
tell my staff, we all make mistakes, including me, right? We all make mistakes. I tell people when I hire them, the first year, I don't expect you to know anything. I expect that this is all, it's a huge learning curve. And you're learning how we do it. You're learning, right? And so you're going to make a million mistakes. You're expected to make a million mistakes. I don't want you to worry about that. We don't expect you to get it right. You're a sponge. You're going to absorb. You're going to ask a ton of questions, give us lots of opportunities to explain why we do things the way we do them. You're going to get to the second year and you're going to discover all the things that you thought you knew that you didn't know, that you did wrong, because now you're in the second year and you understand it better. And it won't be until the third year that you actually find your groove and that you actually are like really confident about that you can make these decisions um, on your own. And it's
yeah,
just the nature of the work.
yeah, that makes sense and aligns with my experience without having put words to that. So,
Yeah, I think you also have to role model. I mean, the other piece of what happened yesterday is that when the staff person, I talked to her yesterday afternoon about how I felt, and when she came in this morning, I said, I think she said, I think there was a miscommunication, and I said I would agree with you, and so I said, I just want to say I'm sorry for our part of the miscommunication. She said, well, I don't think you're the one that should be sorry. You're not the one needing to apologize. I am, and I said, well, I don't believe that because I believe all miscommunication takes two people. If you were only talking to yourself, there'd be no miscommunication. So what if I didn't understand what you meant in the words that you chose, that's not just on you, that's on both of us.
hmm, yeah. Oh, so much juicy goodness in this conversation. Um, Erica, before we sort of wrap up, is there anything that feels unsaid related to difficult or courageous conversations?
The that I really want to acknowledge for anyone that is managing a volunteer program, whatever your title might be, we all have different titles, but anyone that's managing a volunteer program, I came up at a time when there was no education specific to managing volunteers. There was no certificate program. There was not some college course that you could take that really talked about what are the nuances about why management of a volunteer program is different from managing a program run by paid staff. Like no one had that conversation with me. And so a lot of what I learned is trial and error. And I think that's true for most of us that are in this field. And we haven't necessarily done a good job supporting each other because we haven't had a way to be connected with each other. And I always tell people, look, if you're listening to this talk or you come to a presentation that I did for the Tri-State Learning Collaborative, or you hear me at a conference and I say something and you go, I want to talk more with Erica about that, please don't hesitate to reach out and talk to me more about that. My wisdom is useless if I can't share it so that you have an easier time, right? The goal is to have the best volunteer programs available across the board. It's not organization specific.
Mhm. Oh, thank you for saying that. That's a beautiful acknowledgement and a beautiful invitation. So this has just been a rich treasure trove for me of yeah, just soaking up your wisdom. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you for inviting me.